Welcome to Annunciation Radio's Faith with Reasons, the program that examines what the church teaches and why. Faith with Reasons.
Well, welcome aboard. Thank you for joining us for Faith with Reasons on this 19th of July. Wow, show number 453. Ron Finn and Shayne Stanfield here in studio. Shayne, how are you today?
Oh, I'm fine.
Are you?
Yeah.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. Big week?
Yeah, it's been very, very busy.
Yeah?
Yeah, so that's another topic of conversation.
We were on vacation last week, so I'm just now at the point coming up on Thursday to be caught up. So this works out pretty well. But nice to know that the smoke that we've been experiencing, all that haze from the Canadian wildfires, some 400 of them, it was really affecting us the last couple of days, but today we get a reprieve from that.
Yeah.
So the air is much more breathable right now.
I think just this past week, it's probably been the worst that we've seen it in quite some time. I know we've had a couple of waves of this, but the haze has just been obnoxious.
Mm-hmm. Really has. So we're breathing clear once again, and a breath of fresh air is pretty much what we need, especially in our current culture. And we can't wait to interview our guest today, John Bursch, whose Loving God's Children is available now at Sophia Institute Press, sophiainstitute.com. And John serves as Vice President of the Appellate Advocacy for Alliance Defending Freedom, the ADF, the largest public interest law firm in the world, defending religious liberty, free speech, parental rights, marriage and family, and the right to life. I'm glad that John graciously agreed to come on the show today. He's argued 12 cases in the U.S. Supreme Court, including cases defending the Catholic Church's teachings on marriage and sexuality. And John speaks to various groups all over the place, both religious and secular, about topics including marriage, human sexuality, the right to life, and religious liberty. All of those topics are obviously high on our minds, and we're seeing so many instances of attacks in all of these fronts. Now, John's a married father of 5. John is a 4th-degree Knight of Columbus and 3-time past president of the Grand Rapids Legatus chapter, as well as a member of the Pro-Life Partners Foundation Advisory Board. So, John, thank you for joining us, and welcome to Faith with Reasons here on Annunciation Radio.
Thank you. So glad to be here today.
Now, you're a 4th-degree Knight. Now, have you been a 4th-degree Knight? Let's see, they got rid of the swords, and they kind of made some changes there. So, do you have the full regalia, or did you come along after the changes were made?
I came along after the changes were made, which is too bad because I'm one of those who really likes the plumes and the swords and the full thing and all that. So everything kind of is a pendulum. They swung away from that for a while. Maybe someday that'll come back.
Yeah, I have a feeling it will because most feel as you do. Especially when it comes to those events where you're in the cathedral, for example, and maybe there's an ordination, or anytime the Knights Guard is there, you really want to see that full regalia. But that's neither here nor there. We're glad that you're here, and we're so glad of the work that you do. And did I get that right? Is it appellate or appellate?
It's appellate. And
okay.
for those non-lawyers out there, that means that I deal with cases after they're done in the trial court. So there's been a trial, or the court has issued a ruling, and then it goes up to the Court of Appeals or a state Supreme Court or a U.S. Supreme Court, and that's where I get to do my very fun line of work.
Yeah, and I imagine it can be a challenge. Obviously, you're confronting a lot of these issues that are coming up, and it seems like the courts really kind of get their share of that. Everything tends to go to the Supreme Court at one layer or another because no one wants to take no for an answer.
That's absolutely true, and proof of that was our most recent win at the U.S. Supreme Court that you may have heard about, 303 Creative. It involved Lori Smith, a website designer.
Oh, yeah.
And it was kind of the sequel to Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Cake Shop, the cake artist from a few years ago. Jack Phillips did win his case when it was before the court, but it was in kind of a narrow way. They didn't say that what he did was protected speech or protected religious expression. They simply said that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission had acted with hostility towards him and his religious beliefs. So Lori's case comes along, and it was a pre-enforcement lawsuit, so there was no hostility. And the court just announced at the end of June that the First Amendment free speech clause widely applies to all of us to protect us from the government compelling us to speak against our conscience. And that's going to be an important ruling going forward to preserve religious speech in this country going forward.
In her case, dealt with her website, right?
Correct, yeah. She created websites for all kinds of different clients. She never turned down a request because of who the client was, but there were certain messages that she could not express. Mm-hmm. And she wanted to expand her business into the wedding industry, make wedding websites. But she lived in Colorado, the same state as Jack Phillips, and knew that as soon as she did that, Colorado would compel her to celebrate same-sex marriage as well, and that violated her beliefs. And so that was the basis for the Supreme Court case.
So is it me, or obviously it's been a rash of these, it seems, in recent history. Is it somewhat, what's the word I'm looking for, almost like an attack? These are purposeful. It seems like maybe somebody's being picked on?
Oh, no question that these are purposeful. If you look at Jack, the very day that the U.S. Supreme Court announced that it would hear his case, he received a phone call from a transgender attorney in Colorado who asked for a cake celebrating the attorney's gender transition. Mm-hmm. And for the same reasons that Jack couldn't make same-sex wedding cakes, he couldn't make cakes celebrating a gender transition.
Wow.
And so he was immediately sued again. And that case is still pending in the Colorado Supreme Court. He actually lost in the trial court. And the attorney said that they'd keep going after Jack until he changed his views or was punished by the state. And that's what is the whole goal of that litigation.
Wow.
Just amazing. And, yeah, you're right, very purposeful. And that's why I think the work that you do is so important right now. And when you're into public interest law, there's so many issues that you're dealing with out there. And thank God that you're there doing that, you and all your compatriots. And so glad to have this book out now as well, which really the title says it all, Loving God's Children. Because the church really teaches us about our identity and our human sexuality, and we're sons and daughters of God. And these are lessons that promote human flourishing. But the gender activists and their allies in the government, and of course all over the media, in movies and on TV, and even on stage productions, denouncing the church's message of love as harmful and hateful. So responding to that criticism is the challenge that we Catholics have in this day and age, because it's all around us. So this is a very timely book, number one, but it also ties right into this particular show, Faith with Reasons, which really delves into what the church teaches and why, and that's exactly what your book does. So tell us a little bit about this book and how it came about.
Yeah, it actually was an outgrowth of the work that I do. I found that over the last 5 to 6 years that the religious liberty and free speech cases that I was litigating increasingly involved gender ideology. And I can look at my docket now, and I've got cases involving female athletes who lost state track and field championships to males identifying as females. I've got cases where we're litigating on behalf of counselors who want to be able to counsel minors with their consent and their parents' consent to align their minds with their bodies rather than pursuing what can be a really harmful transgender identity. And in 20 states and more than 100 local jurisdictions, if you engage in that type of counseling, it's going to be a reason to have your professional license revoked. We've got cases and have had cases in the past involving privacy spaces where local, state, or the federal government are forcing boys who identify as girls into the girls' locker rooms and showers, their college dormitories, things like that. Switching to employment, you've got colleges and public schools and others that compel employees to use the preferred pronouns and gender identity reflexive titles rather than sex-based titles and pronouns against their free speech rights. And you even have new laws being passed all the time to force religious organizations and religious-minded businesses to both accommodate messages, kind of like Lori Smith and Jack Phillips, that contradict their beliefs on gender and sex, or that force them to hire people who live out transgender lifestyles in direct violation of the Catholic Church's teachings. And so it was a result of all that work that I really started to dig into the Church's teachings so that I could talk to lay Catholics in the pew about what the Church teaches, why it teaches what it does, and then bring to bear the science and the legal and the media angles that I confronted in my work. And so this book, Loving God's Children, The Church and Gender Ideology, is meant for someone who doesn't understand anything about the Catholic Church's teachings, or someone who might know quite a bit, to give them the language and the tools and the knowledge that they need so that they can talk to their family members, especially their kids, but also their neighbors and their employers and their coworkers and others about the true love that the Church teaches when it talks about human sexuality, rather than the false love that gender activists portray.
So where did all this start? I know this is a lot of people claim that this has been going on for decades, but my understanding is there's a difference between let's just say that you have a man that is likes to wear women's clothes, dresses in drag. There's a difference between that and somebody who actually denies themselves as being male. And that they have some sort of gender in between male and female, and there's probably a couple hundred genders out there now that they claim. So, am I on the right track here? Is there a difference, or has this been in the works for a long time, or is this something that's just relatively crept up in culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it's something that crept up slowly for a long time, but then kind of exploded about 8 years ago, and I can explain that timeline.
Yeah.
The genesis of the movement goes all the way back to the 1950s, and there was a psychologist, his name was John Money, ironically, given all the money that Planned Parenthood and other gender clinics get for prescribing puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and performing surgeries on kids who express a transgender identity. And his experiment involved two boys who were identical twins. And one of the boys had a botched circumcision, and the doctors weren't really sure what to do about that. So with the consent of the parents, they decided that they would treat the boy as a girl. And so then this psychologist, John Money, studied them as they grew up, and he declared that there was a difference between someone's sex and their perceived sense of gender, and that those two could be aligned or they could be not aligned. Now, after the fact, we found out from the twins that John Money was forcing them to engage in sex acts and other disgusting and reprehensible things, that all of the research was flawed, and you really couldn't take away the conclusions that he drew from this because he was rigging the dice, so to speak, in the way that he was conducting the experiments, in addition to abusing the boys. And yet that started the transgender train. And then slowly academia and the medical profession started to come along with that. And then where things really took a hard shift was in 2015. And that's the year that the U.S. Supreme Court decided Obergefell, the same-sex marriage case, finding a constitutional right to same-sex marriage, even though the Constitution is silent about marriage. And in the lead-up to that case, you could already see those who were pushing hard for the transgender portion, the T, to be added to the LGBT, to make the LGBT, to get transgender front and center so that everybody would start paying attention to it. The first thing they did is they found a young boy who transitioned to be a girl on live TV, basically, wrote a children's book, I Am Jazz, and it became a very popular children's book, and popular TV show started to get that into the culture. And then Bruce Jenner, the famous Olympian decathlete, transitioned to a woman and became Caitlyn Jenner. And that story hit in all the sports publications and the mainstream media precisely as the same-sex marriage opinion was coming down. We all kind of knew ahead of time that's the way the court was going to rule in the marriage case. And so now all of a sudden it was going to immediately pivot to this transgender movement. Now, since then, it's been picked up everywhere. The government has been trying to force gender ideology into schools and other places, both at the federal level, in the Obama and Biden administrations, but also in state curriculums, where they're literally asking children who are in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, to figure out what their own sense of gender is, even if it doesn't agree with their sex, and then to identify with that and pursue dressing and pronouns and bathroom use and things like that consistent with this perceived sense of gender identity. You see it in TV and movies, all across the board. There are transgender characters being introduced in the same way that same-sex characters were introduced in the 1980s and 90s to desensitize people and to think about that as something normal that we should just accept. And then finally, social media is where it's the worst. There are literally millions of things on TikTok, on Instagram, and other places where young people are being exposed to gender ideology. And the problem is that, unlike maybe in the 70s when you had some men who decided they wanted to dress up as women, what these social media things are telling kids is that if they're uncomfortable in their sex as they're going through puberty, or they don't have friends, or their social life isn't good, the problem must be that they're transgender or some other, as you mentioned, there's literally hundreds of different gender identities now. And those videos encourage those kids, and then they get celebrated when they embrace other identities, whether that's a trans identity or a two-spirit identity or a non-binary identity. It kind of goes on and on. But they think they've solved the problem that every human being has gone through as they went through their adolescent and teenage years in history, that their struggles, their confusion, their anxiety, sometimes their depression, can all be solved by their new friends encouraging them to be a different gender. And so that's how you see something like the report from the New Jersey public schools that just came out, which says that, I forget, it was like a 4,000% increase in kids who identify as non-binary or trans or queer. It's just this social contagion that's a tidal wave that goes far past anything that John Money or gender activists in the 1970s could have ever imagined. And what we know from science and from the church's teachings is that it's just an incredibly dangerous path. It's one that leads to long-term mental health issues. If you start taking the drugs, it leads to permanent infertility and other health problems, and ultimately really high suicide rates. So that was a long answer, but that's kind of the trajectory that we took from the 1950s until today.
That's interesting to see that kind of a timeline, and to those like me, when you think about how this focus has increased and this agenda has been pushed so aggressively in our schools. Let's not tell the parents. Let's keep it quiet. Let's do things without them. We don't need the parents anymore. It's disturbing to think that modern culture is embracing this gender ideology, because I think to most right-thinking people, or most people with half a brain, there are certain things that can't be denied, and biology is certainly one of them. So not only is this whole gender ideology wrong, but dangerous for parents, for families, and of course, as you mentioned, in the sporting world and in the medical profession. So this book is very important. Again, just to remind people, our guest today, John Bursch, whose book, Loving God's Children, The Church and Gender Ideology, is just out from Ignatius Press or Sophia Institute Press. And in this book, of course, you're really helping really parents and others really kind of confront Catholics living in a culture that promotes this gender fluidity, with a range of topics that are covered in this book. So as we are confronted with these issues, this is really kind of a good how-to book to logically answer people and speak about this with some sort of authority.
Yeah, that's the hope. And it's intended not only for the lay people in the pews, but also for priests who might struggle with some of these issues. In addition to going through all the theology, which I hope we have an opportunity to kind of take a deeper dive into, in the science, same comment there. It draws on the teachings from the Vatican, from Pope Francis himself, but also some of the courageous bishops in the United States who have put out detailed documents on this subject to help guide priests and parishes through these difficult issues when they have to confront them. So, for example, if a transgender person presents themselves for an RCIA program or for marriage, how is a church supposed to respond to that? Or if someone comes to a Catholic school and they want to dress as the opposite sex and use their own preferred pronouns, how is the Catholic school supposed to respond to that? And many Catholics don't realize that the church has really good answers to all those questions. And the questions' answers may be countercultural. It does not involve just affirming what everybody believes about themselves or what they want to happen, but that what the church teaches is true love. And that's kind of one of the root points of the book, is to help re-explain to people how the Catholic Church understands the concept of love itself. Love is not a feeling, it's not an emotion. It never involves making someone else feel good about themselves, but instead it's always willing the best for the other person so that they can flourish the way that God wants them to flourish. And sometimes the desires and the wants that we have aren't consistent with our human flourishing. Every parent understands that if a child wants to touch a hot stove, that the parent won't let them do that, no matter how much the child wants that. Even if the child says that they'll feel better and they'll feel bad if they don't get to touch the hot stove, they won't do it because they know that doing so will burn them. It'll cause them long-term harm. And it's the same when it comes to gender ideology, that when we use preferred pronouns, that when we embrace the LGBT pride movement, Pride Month, we wear ally pins, all those things, we're setting kids down a road that ultimately will lead to their harm and their destruction rather than their flourishing.
I do know that's lure from many people. They want to be loving, they want to be supportive, so they don't see the harm in maybe wearing a lapel pin or participating one way or another in some sort of pride, just to show some sort of solidarity with what the culture says is a minority group in our culture that's being somehow oppressed. So that's probably a good place to start. We as Catholics could be educated as to not participate in that sort of thing, because it would be, somewhat affirming of a culture, push, activities that are, they don't align with church teaching. Correct?
Absolutely, that's correct. And to want to show compassion and solidarity and support for our brothers and sisters is a good Catholic instinct. Everybody should want to do that. But we need to be careful about what we support. So to take an example of another issue where an individual's mind and their body do not align, consider anorexia.
Oh, yeah.
There the person has this unshakable belief that they're overweight, and so they need to lose weight. And no loving parent, no loving employer, no loving family member or neighbor would ever encourage that person to eat less or to have liposuction or anything like that, so that they can align their vision in their mind with how their body actually looks, because we all recognize that's destructive. And for the same reasons, you wouldn't go to a parade celebrating people who suffer from anorexia in eating less or trying to lose weight, because all of that would be cruel and harmful. And although people don't understand it because the media is so cagey about it, those are the same types of harms that you can experience when you follow that road of gender ideology to its logical conclusion. That there's nothing loving or caring about adopting pronouns that someone prefers if that's going to lead to them taking drugs that will result in their permanent infertility, or that will result in a surgery that mutilates a minor's genitals. Those are not loving things. And what's difficult is that right at the beginning, when you're talking about the ally pin and you're talking about the preferred pronouns and things like that, what some people will say, even some Catholics will say, well, it doesn't do any harm. I can still show love and respect for someone by using their preferred pronouns. But what we've learned from science is that if a minor is suffering from gender dysphoria, they're expressing an identity that is a different gender than their sex, that in 80 to 95% of the cases, if they're just left alone, they'll naturally align their mind with their body and there'll be no further issues. But when you start them down that road of affirmation, when you start using the pronouns, you allow them to use the opposite sex's clothes and their bathroom and shower facilities and things like that, there's a nearly 100% chance that they're going to continue down a road of gender dysphoria with all the associated mental illness and physical side effects of drug use and things like that we've been talking about. So even right at the very beginning, when people think they're being compassionate, it's really not. And as we know, being loving towards someone always requires you to speak the truth. And if we speak lies about the human body, if we speak lies about human sexuality, of course that will naturally lead towards destruction. And that's exactly what the science shows.
Well, absolutely. And they're coming at us like bullies, too, because it's like you're either with us or you're against us. So you either advocate for us or you hate us, which is also very disingenuous. But it's just jam this down your throats and then sneak behind your back. It's really insidious, and it can only come from the devil.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that, because the very first page of the book, the introduction, talks about a June 2019 document that the Catholic Church published. It was called Male and Female, He Created Them, Towards a Path of Dialogue on the Question of Gender Theory in Education. And it outlined certain truths about the human person. And it emphasized that we need to respect every person so that no one suffers bullying and violence and unjust discrimination. But it also challenged this notion of gender fluidity, and it critiques the idea that our identity revolves around our choice rather than the biological differences that our bodies display, since we are embodied souls, and so our bodies say something about who we are. And the New York Times immediately responded to the Church's document with an article that said the Church's very loving teaching encouraged hatred, bigotry, and violence. So they're really drawing the battle lines there. Either you're going to go along with the LGBT agenda and everything that it stands for, even to the destruction of children at the end of the day, or you're a bigot and you hate people. And obviously that's not true. The Church loves everybody, again, in the true sense of love, wants everyone to flourish and to be the best possible version of themselves. We want to will the good of the other, but you can only do that through the truth, not through false senses of the human body and what we think we are.
Yeah, tolerance is... You're right. That's a Catholic instinct. We want to be tolerant and loving toward others of differing views, but that's not reciprocated at all, and it can be a very dangerous thing. And we're seeing the effects of that right now in our culture. We're going to take a little bit of a break. John Bursch, our guest today, Loving God's Children: The Church and Gender Ideology. Book that's just coming out. I guess it's going to be released August 15th, so a couple of weeks out. But you can probably pre-order that at your favorite local Catholic bookstore, or you can go on the website at sophiainstitute.com and order it. We'll be right back.
Carry the home missions close to your heart by downloading the free Glen Mary Home Missioners mobile app. Glen Mary brings the Catholic faith to rural parts of Appalachia in the South where it is not effectively present. The free Glen Mary app is a one-stop shop to access daily reflections written by missioners, prayer resources, and information about mission in the United States. The app is available for iPhones and Androids. To download, search Glen Mary in your mobile device's app store or visit glenmary.org/app. That's glenmary.org/app.
Experience the incredible story of a woman who Time magazine named the most influential Catholic woman in the United States. Rita Rizzo, the future Mother Angelica, grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Canton, Ohio during the Great Depression. Rita's father abandoned the family before she was 5 years old. Her early years of trial were compounded by a debilitating illness until she was healed by Jesus through a woman named Rhoda Wise. That healing set her life on a course that would ultimately change the world. Learn the amazing story of Rita Rizzo at the Mother Angelica Museum in her hometown of Canton, Ohio. Go to www.motherangelicamuseum.com. Be inspired. Plan your visit now at motherangelicamuseum.com.
Every weekday afternoon at 3, join us for our live and interactive Divine Mercy Chaplet. Do you have something or someone you're praying for? Imagine the power of hundreds of people praying for your intention. We have several ways for you to share your request. You can visit our app and go to the prayer request button, send an email to chapletprayer@gmail.com, or call our prayer request line at 419 888-2966. Here at Annunciation Radio, we're praying for you.
Now, back to Faith with Reasons here on Annunciation Radio.
Hey, welcome back here. Shayne Stanfield with Ron Finn. Today we're blessed to have John Bursch discussing his upcoming book, Loving God's Children, from Sophia Institute Press. John serves as Vice President of the Appellate Advocacy for Alliance Defending Freedom, the largest public interest law firm in the world, defending religious liberty, free speech, parental rights, marriage and family, and the right to life. And he is quite busy. John argued 12 cases in the U.S. Supreme Court, including cases defending Catholic Church's teaching on marriage and sexuality. He speaks frequently to groups, both religious and secular, about topics including marriage, human sexuality, right to life, and religious liberty. He's a father of five. Is a fourth-degree Knight of Columbus and a three-time past president of the Grand Rapids Legatus Chapter and a member of the Pro-Life Partners Foundation Advisory Board. So we've really just kind of scratched the surface, John, of your upcoming book, once again, Loving God's Children. And I think that we probably should just get right into I think what I would say is the obvious here. I mean, there is such thing as of objective truth. You know, we've got people that believe there's something that they're not, whether it's a legitimate mental disorder or it's culture infused. And coming from an attorney, we could use some advice from you as to how do we defend something that's so crucial to I would say life, something as such as objective truth.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up because it's a failure to recognize that there is an objective truth which provides the fuel for movements like same-sex marriage or gender ideology. And so the very first chapter of the book is devoted to that topic. It wasn't too many years ago when Pope Benedict was asked what the greatest threat to the world was. And he didn't say abortion, he didn't say wars, he said moral relativism. And moral relativism is this idea that there is no objective truth, that what's true for me is only true for me, and what's true for you is only true for you. And shockingly, more than 90% of our young people today endorse moral relativism. And the reason they do that is because there's something appealing about moral relativism, that if you're never telling someone that they're wrong about anything, you don't have to confront them. So it seems nice and it seems compassionate, some of those instincts that we were talking about earlier that many Catholics have. And we don't want to be mean to people. Well, if I don't ever disagree with you about anything, then that won't happen. So, take abortion as an example. Mm-hmm. It's an objective truth, a scientific truth, that life begins at conception. Ask any biologist that you've ever met, and they will tell you that from the moment of conception, that embryo is a human life. And we can debate whether that human life has value. Of course it does. The Church teaches it does. But that's an irrefutable truth. And yet even Catholics today might say something like, well, abortion is wrong for me because that's the taking of human life, but I would never impose my views on anybody else because that may not be true for them. Well, that's nonsense. It's true for everybody. Mm-hmm. And so before we can even start to have a discussion about gender ideology, we need to move Catholics, and especially young Catholics, off the mark that there is no such thing as truth, because otherwise debates about gender ideology and abortion and other important issues just become debates that are an exchange of opinions. Like my favorite ice cream is chocolate and yours might be vanilla. And we can never get to the other person to think about or change their mind because it's just an opinion. But when we're talking about the reality of the human body, the fact that we're embodied souls, that our human sex, our male or femaleness, expresses something about who we are, that changes everything. But we first got to recognize that a truth like that can be a truth.
Well, that is so true. And as soon as you go down that road, everything is open season. We're seeing so many advances on the opposition side. So many attacks each and every day. I know here in Ohio we're dealing with the onslaught of pushing for abortion availability through all phases of pregnancy. for parental shielding, I guess, from schools and other groups that are pushing gender dysphoria, really, on people. I know we've got an issue coming up in a special election in August that hopefully will increase the level of votes needed to change the Constitution for the state of Ohio from 51 simple majority to 60%. And the United States Constitution requires 66%, I think, to make any changes on it. But we know what's coming in November. There's going to be a legal push and all kinds of money coming in order to change or amend the Constitution to allow such things as leading kids down these paths and not telling the parents about it, and so many other terrible things. So we see these attacks happening all the time, and that's why I think a book like this is so important, because you're explaining to people the church's understanding of what it means to truly love another individual, what human sexuality is all about, these objective truths that exist that can't be denied. And we can't be giving up these freedoms. We can't give in.
No, we have to go back to those basics for a couple of reasons. First, the entire LGBTQIA+, if you wanted to add those, movement is anti-Catholic. It's anti-Christian because it denies two fundamental truths about human existence. First, that God created marriage to be between a man and a woman, and second, that he created us male and female. And some people would say, well, why is that so important? I mean, is that really part of God's design? And that goes back to John Paul II's theology of the body, which is the foundation for our understanding of all these things. Because although the church has always had these teachings, it was his theology of the body that really started to tease out the details in a beautiful way that makes it easy for us as non-theologians to understand. And the picture that he paints in theology of the body is that when a man comes together with a woman in the sacrament of marriage, their love is so powerful that it can result in the creation of a new person, a son or a daughter that needs to have its own name. And it's the one time as human beings when we're allowed to actually co-create something with God. All the rest of the time, we're just moving around matter. We're taking wood and bricks and turning it into buildings, or we might even be smashing atoms together. But that's the one time in a marriage between a man and a woman when we can co-create with God. But the beautiful thing is that love, man, woman, child, is an icon of the Trinity itself, where the love that is exchanged between the Father and the Son is so powerful that it proceeds as its own person, the Holy Spirit. And that there's three persons, but yet one person. It's modeled in the way that our human sexuality was created. God gave us a little window into his identity by giving us marriage between man and a woman and a sexual identity as a male or a female. And so to embrace any of the things that the LGBT movement is pursuing is to reject the most fundamental understanding of what it means to be a human person as the Catholic Church has always defined it.
So what does science really say about gender ideology? Because so far, we've hit on, we've discussed objective truth, so the objective truth there is, there are men and there are women, and you're either one or the other. But, you've got this gender ideology out there that seems to be non-scientific, and yet they claim it to be scientific. So what does science really say?
Yeah, they claim it to be scientific in the same way that the American Medical Association used to claim that there was scientifically nothing wrong with people smoking tobacco. And we know how that turned out. So you can't always trust the major medical associations when they've got a political axe to grind. That was true with cigarettes. It's equally true with gender ideology. So what the science tells us is that there is no such thing as a man born in a woman's body or a woman born in a man's body or someone being born without any sense of gender, binary or non-binary. That there's nothing that shows that. People can express a feeling, but you can't test that scientifically, and there's no chromosome, there's no gene, there's no chemical that will tell you that that's true. I mean, it's just something that you have to accept on faith if you're going to believe in gender ideology. We also know that for those who have a psychological issue where they do have an innate, intense feeling that's different from their biological sex, that's what the psychologist called gender dysphoria, that can be a very difficult, painful condition for people, and that they do have higher suicide rates than those of the general population. But science also tells us that the so-called remedies or prescriptions that Planned Parenthood and gender clinics say you should give that. You should give puberty blockers to stop kids from going through puberty so they can decide what gender they are. You should give them cross-sex hormones so they can become the opposite sex. You should eventually engage in invasive surgeries that mutilate their sexual parts so that they can become what they think they are. The best science that we have shows that over the long term that there's no evidence that does any good. And in fact, the best long-term study we have of adults that came from Sweden, which has been kind of at the forefront of the science and is a very accepting culture when it comes to transgender identities, that best long-term study of adults shows that even after they go through full transition, they do the surgery and everything, that their mental health outcomes are worse, their physical health outcomes are worse, and that heightened suicide rate, which is 12 times the general population for someone suffering from gender dysphoria, it jumps to 19 times the general population. So going through all of that is worse because you're not solving any of the mental health issues that cause the dysphoria in the first place. All you're doing is putting a Band-Aid on it by changing someone's body in a way that aligns with stereotypes about what men and women are supposed to be. And that's really the root of all this. It comes down to stereotypes. It's not the type of clothes that you wear, or how your body looks that makes you male or female. It's the fact that you've got an XY or an XX chromosome. And every single cell in your body will always have those chromosomes to the end of your life, even if you take the puberty blockers, even if you take the cross-sex hormones, even if you go through the surgery. There's something fundamentally fixed about our sex that can't be changed. And simply professing that you align with some cultural stereotypes about a sex that might be different than yours doesn't change what your body is. And so the science on this is clear. The problem is our culture doesn't follow the science. Now, there is some good news in that department. The United States is now the world's leading experts on mutilating children and affirming transgender identities. But it actually started with gender clinics in the UK, Finland, Sweden, other places in Europe. And they're now looking at the scientific evidence, which shows the long-term outcomes for their patients, and they're all pulling back on that. And they're saying, we're not going to allow this for minors anymore because we don't have any evidence that this is doing any good at all. And you see some states in the United States trying to follow that lead by prohibiting puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for minors, for instance. And just a huge outcry and backlash from the LGBT activists and even places like the American Medical Association, which should know better, insisting that those laws are the ones that are harming kids rather than their own practices, which for them are very lucrative.
Well, I do think that there, a lot of these organizations like the American Medical Association, it's my opinion, a lot of them, they're bought and paid for. I think they're more of a political machine now than something that's truly serving the benefits of the medical profession. It's when you see so many of these institutes, these affiliations of doctors and whatnot that literally come out publicly and say such ridiculous things, you have to scratch your head and wonder if they're really on board with this, or if they're receiving some sort of cultural pressure to conform to this, because quite frankly the doctors in those organizations, the vast majority of them, it doesn't seem like they believe this. And yet the professions do.
Yeah, they should know better. But what you see with these organizations is not only political motives, profit motives, perhaps giving in to public pressure and things like that, but you also see them actively trying to subvert those who want to dig deeper into the science to see if those groups' views are correct. So, for example, numerous times at the national bodies of these organizations, the American Medical Association, the American Association of Psychologists, things like that, members have come forward with proposals to further study this issue. And those things have been shot down or tabled so that they can't even get the research off the ground. They don't actually want to know. And yet we have these doctors and scientists in European countries saying, we do know the path that you're following is not helpful. It's not making people better. And so we need to rethink the whole thing. So it's just a dirty shame that that's where the major medical professional organizations in our country have gone.
Boy, isn't that the truth? Again, Loving God's Children is the name of the book. It's coming out soon from Sophia Institute Press, and John Bursch, the author, is joining us now on Faith with Reasons. And this book not only delves into all these topics, it also kind of shows us what our response as Catholics can be. For example, in the workplace, I mean, we're seeing people's jobs threatened because they won't toe the line and honor someone's wish to be, mispronounced, as I would say. And this book does help us in those situations, does it not?
It does. It provides advice about how to confront that and to remind people that they do have rights. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court just reaffirmed at the end of June, at the same time that it issued the 303 creative opinion that we were talking about with the website designer, another case called Groff, Groff, involving a postal worker who, because of his religious beliefs, could not work on Sundays, which he believed were a day of worship and rest, the same way that we do as Catholics. We give that day to the Lord, not delivering packages. And the Supreme Court recognized that in Title VII, which is the federal employment statute, it governs all employers, public and private, that they have a duty to give religious accommodations to employees who can't do something because of their religious faith, unless it causes an undue hardship to the business. And certainly when you're talking about things like preferred pronouns or wearing ally pins and things like that, it's not essential to the business that everybody get on board with that if it violates their religious beliefs. And as we were discussing earlier, when Catholics start to give into that, when they start using preferred pronouns and wearing the pin and going to the pride events and things like that, unknowingly they're supporting a culture that's hurting kids. Yeah. And if we want to be loving examples of the church, if we want to be Jesus Christ hand and feet, we can't ever dip our toe into those waters. We can't even begin to support something that will harm children.
No. Yeah, because no matter what the intention is, that endorsement turns into an embracing of it, and you're joining forces with them. You're helping promote their cause, whether you intend to or not. That's how they're using you.
Absolutely, and they will not stop until everyone bows the knee to the LGBT flag. But we can't do it. And, the place we need to start is not our place of employment, although I hope Catholics do stand up there, but it's in the home. From the time that our kids are little, we need to talk to them about the church's teachings on human sexuality and marriage, and about their bodies, and about how God loves us because he created us this way. And make sure that those messages are going across. And we also need to be very cautious about giving them access to social media and television programming and things like that are teaching them the wrong messages about these things. And as I mentioned, it's pervasive. There's a show called Blue's Clues. You may be familiar with it.
Yep.
It's a children's show targeted for 3 and 4-year-olds. It's kind of a combination of cartoons and live action. And last year, during Pride Month, they had a Pride Parade celebration during Blue's Clues. So if you put your 3-year-old down in front of the TV thinking, I can say my rosary or get some laundry done while they watch Blue's Clues, what they would have seen was an LGBT parade where every parade float celebrated a different aspect of the LGBT movement. Wow. And there was a song. It was the tune of the ants were marching one by one, but the words had all been changed. And it was sung by a very famous drag performer. And on one of those floats, they had a family of beavers, and one of the beavers had tape across her chest to show where her breasts had been removed because she was a trans beaver. And if there was any doubt about that, the show's creators confirmed that was the intent of the beaver with the tape on its chest, that it was breast removal. So that's what your 3-year-old is getting.
It's indoctrination.
It is indoctrination. So we need to be on guard with the television programs our kids watch, with the TV programs they have. Don't give them a smartphone. If they absolutely need it to get a hold of you when they're at school, then don't let them have TikTok and Instagram and these other social media sites where they're going to get access to all of this indoctrination. And then talk to them about the church's teachings. And it'll be difficult conversations. It'll be sensitive conversations. But the more work that you put in on the front end and the more parental supervision that you exercise, the less pain it'll be for you on the back end, because you'll keep your kids true to the teachings of the church, and we all know that's what's best for human flourishing.
So true, and what a great reminder, because kids are getting these cell phones younger and younger these days because they just want to play games on them. Now, what can be the harm in that? But that's how the infiltration is happening. And I think above all, and your book points this out too, we really need to kind of develop and work on our own virtue so that, we stand strong and firm.
Yeah, that's absolutely critical. I think you've probably heard many Catholic theologians and priests and others say this, but we're never just staying in place. We're either moving closer to God and improving our relationship with Him, or we're moving in the opposite direction. And if we're not affirmatively working on our virtues, things like prudence and patience and kindness and things like that, then we're moving in the opposite direction. And as parents, we have to be so disciplined. I have 5 kids of my own. They were all born within 9.5 years of each other. When they were little, I know how exhausting it can be to be a parent. But when you give over your time to the iPad or the television, then you're giving up something that you may regret later. It's critically important. And even aside from all the indoctrination about the LGBT issues that we've been talking about, your kids crave that time with you. I look around restaurants these days, and I see families sitting at tables, and everybody's on their device, and no one's communicating with each other. Mm-hmm. What a lost opportunity to make a connection that's going to last the rest of your life with your children. And you only have a short time. 18 years seems like a long time, but it goes by really fast. You've only got a short time to make those connections and to solidify those relationships, to do all the teaching that you need to do. We as parents need to step up and dig into that.
How big of a book is this, John?
It's about 250 pages, I believe. Maybe not quite that long. Maybe it's a little over 200 pages. I haven't even looked at the last copy yet, so I'm not sure. But just to kind of give you and all your listeners a sense of where it starts and ends, it begins with the moral relativism versus objective truth that we were talking about. Mm-hmm. It has a chapter that explains John Paul II's theology of the body in very simple, easy-to-understand terms, ones that you can easily pass on to your kids. Mm-hmm. It then has an extensive discussion about the Church's teaching on gender ideology specifically, how the U.S. bishops have been so strong in coming out and explaining that there is no such thing as a man born in a woman's body, that we need to resist the preferred pronouns and the affirming and stay true to the notion that we're embodied souls. And same for Pope Francis's thoughts on that. He's talked about this, saying that we can't truly encounter another person in a reciprocal exchange of love unless we're our authentic selves. And the only time that we're our authentic selves is when we recognize our sex, because we are embodied souls. Mm-hmm. Then there's a whole chapter that goes into the science that we've been talking about. It's got extensive citations to medical studies, scientific studies to back up all of that information. There's a whole chapter about identity and how we should be talking to our kids about their identities, that our identities don't churn on how we feel about things. They don't even churn on, our race or things like that. Our identity is as children of God. And if you can get that identity right, then everything else kind of flows from that.
Amen.
After that, it talks, again, with the scientific background about the dangers for those who reject their sex and go through these procedures. There's a whole chapter on detransitioners, those who have transitioned to another gender identity and then come back again after they realize how fruitless that was and all the suffering that they went through as a result of listening to the YouTube videos and the TikTok videos and the media and the American Medical Association. Then there's a chapter that talks about how gender ideology harms others. C.S. Lewis talks about our culture. All of us are sailing ships, and if one ship gets off course, then that interrupts others too. And so just, one ship gets off course on gender ideology, it can result in broken families, it can result in further harms to others. And we see how, as we've discussed, people are being attacked for expressing their Catholic beliefs. Finally, it talks about the culture and the movies and the TV and the social media and all that, where you need to look out, where you need to protect your children. And then it concludes with that long chapter of questions and answers. The answers are almost all quotes directly from bishop statements or church documents that help walk us through all the different scenarios where gender ideology might come up in everyday life, including where you can find resources. If you have a child who suddenly comes to you and says that they're transgender or non-binary, or if you have a friend who does the same, just how you should respond to those different situations and where you can go for more help. So the hope is that this book is kind of an A to Z, soup to nuts summary of everything that a Catholic would need to know about the subject to be able to deal with it in employment, to deal with it in the family, to deal with it in the culture, and respond in authentically loving ways that truly will the good of others and that reflect the type of human flourishing that the Church wants for all of us.
It sounds like an excellent resource for Catholics, especially Catholic parents, and any parent that's got younger kids today are certainly being, as you expressed previously, subjected to this. And we're going to look forward to seeing this when it comes out in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's released on August 15th. You can order copies ahead of time, pre-orders, as you mentioned, at the Sophia Institute website. And it's got the imprimatur of my local bishop here, so you can know that nothing in it is in any contradiction or tension with church teachings about these subjects.
Wonderful.
And again, Loving God's Children, the Church and Gender Ideology, available for pre-order now and coming soon to a Catholic bookstore near you. John Bursch, thank you so much. God bless you for the work that you're doing.
Yes, thank you.
And for really providing the rest of us with a terrific resource that is so needed right now. So thanks, and Godspeed in your continued work.
My pleasure. God bless you both and all your listeners as well.
God bless.
Thanks for joining us on Faith with Reasons this week. We hope you'll join us again next week. In fact, next week, right now, Evangelist Richard Lane and Father Mark Davis are at the National Black Caucus, and he's going to come on the show next week and talk about that a little bit on Faith with Reasons.